Bianca, fair Bianca, who could dwell with safety on her dark and hazel gaze, nor find there lurked in it a witching spell, fatal to balmy nights and blessed days? The peaceful breath that made the bosom swell, she turned to gas and set it in a blaze. Each eye of hers had love's Uperion in it, that he could light his link at in a minute. So that wherever in her charms she shone, 1,000 breasts were kindled into flame. Maidens who cursed her looks forgot their own, and beaux were turned to flambeaux where she came. All hearts indeed were conquered but her own, which none could ever temper down or tame. In short, to take our haberdasher's hints, she might have written over it, from flints. She was in truth the wonder of her sex, at least in Venice, where with eyes of brown, tenderly languid, ladies seldom vex an amorous gentle with a needless frown. Where gondolas convey guitars by pecks, and love at casements climbeth up and down, whom for his tricks and custom and that kind, some have considered a Venetian blind. Howbeit this difference was quickly taught, amongst more youths who had this cruel jailer. To hapless Julio, all in vain he sought, with each new moon, his hatter and his tailor. In vain the richest paduasoy he bought, and went in brand new beaver to assail her, as if to show that love had made him smart, all over, and not merely round his heart. In vain he laboured through the sylvan park. Bianca haunted him, that where she came her learned eyes in wondering might mark the twisted cipher of her maiden name, wholesomely going through a course of bark. No one was touched and troubled by his flame, except the dryads, those old maids that grow in trees, like wooden dolls in embryo. In vain complaining elegies he writ, and taught his tuneful instrument to grieve, and sang in quavers how his heart was split, constant beneath her lattice with each eve. She mocked his wooing with her wicked wit, and slashed his suit so that it matched his sleeve, till he grew silent at the vesper star, and, quite despairing, hamstringed his guitar. Bianca's heart was coldly frosted o'er with snows unmelting, an eternal sheet, but his was red within him like the core of old Vesuvius with perpetual heat. And oft he longed internally to pour his flames and glowing lava at her feet, but when his burnings he began to spout, she stopped his mouth and put the crater out. Meanwhile he wasted in the eyes of men, so thin he seemed a sort of skeleton key, suspended at death's door so pale, and then he turned as nervous as an aspen tree. The life of man is 80 years and 10, but he was perishing at 23. For people truly said as grief grew stronger, it could not shorten his poor life much longer. For why he neither slept, nor drank, nor fed, nor relished any kind of mirth below. Fire in his heart and frenzy in his head, love had become his universal foe. Salt in his sugar, nightmare in his bed, at last no wonder wretched Julio, a sorrow-ridden thing in utter dearth of hope, made up his mind to cut her girth. For hapless lovers always died of old, sooner than chew reflection's bitter cud. So Thisbe stuck herself, what time 'tis told, the tender-hearted mulberries wept blood. And so poor Sappho, when her boy was cold, drowned her salt teardrops in a salter flood. Their fame still breathing, though their breath be past, for those old suitors lived beyond their last. So Julio went to drown when life was dull, but took his corks, and merely had a bath, and once he pulled the trigger at his skull, but merely broke a window in his wrath. And once his hopeless being to annul, he tied a back thread to a beam of lath, a line so ample 'twas a query whether 'twas meant to be a halter or a tether. Smile not in scorn that Julio did not thrust his sorrows through. 'Tis horrible to die, and come down with our little all of dust, that done of all duns to satisfy, to leave life's pleasant city as we must, in death's most dreary sponging house to lie, where all, even all our personals must go, to pay the debt of nature that we owe. So Julio lived. 'Twas nothing but a pet he took at life, a momentary spite. Besides, he hoped that time would some day get the better of love's flame, however bright. A thing that time has never compassed yet, for love we know is an immortal light. Like that old fire that, quite beyond a doubt, was always in, for none have found it out. Meanwhile Bianca dreamed. 'Twas once when night along the darkened plain began to creep, like a young Hottentot whose eyes are bright, although in skin as sooty as a sweep. The flowers had shut their eyes, the zephyr light was gone, for it had rocked the leaves to sleep, and all the birds had laid their heads under their wings, sleeping in feather beds. Lone in her chamber sat the dark-eyed maiden, by easy stages jaunting through her prayers, but listening sidelong to a serenade that robbed the saints a little of their shares. For Julio underneath the lattice played his dear Vieni and such amorous airs, born only underneath Italian skies, where every fiddle has a bridge of sighs. Sweet was the tune, the words were even sweeter, praising her eyes, her lips, her nose, her hair, with all the common tropes wherewith in metre the hackney poets overcharged their fare. Her shape was like Diana's but completer, her brow with Grecian Helen's might compare. Cupid, alas, was cruel Sagittarius, Julio, the weeping waterman Aquarius. Now, after listing to such laudings rare, 'twas very natural indeed to go. What if she did postpone one little prayer, to ask her mirror if it was not so? 'Twas a large mirror, none the worse for wear, reflecting her at once from top to toe, and there she gazed upon that glossy track, that showed her front face, though it gave her back. And long her lovely eyes were held in thrall by that dear page where first the woman reads that Julio was no flatterer, none at all, she told herself, and then she told her beads. Meanwhile the nerves insensibly let fall 2 curtains fairer than the lily breeds, for sleep had crept and kissed her unawares, just at the halfway milestone of her prayers. Then like a dropping rose so bended she, till her bowed head upon her hand reposed, but still she plainly saw, or seemed to see, that fair reflection, though her eyes were closed. A beauty bright, as it was wont to be, a portrait fancy painted while she dozed. 'Tis very natural, some people say, to dream of what we dwell on in the day. Still shone her face, yet not, alas, the same, but 'gan some dreary touches to assume, and sadder thoughts with sadder changes came. Her eyes resigned their light, her lips their bloom. Her teeth fell out, her tresses did the same, her cheeks were tinged with bile, her eyes with rheum. There was a throbbing at her heart within, for oh, there was a shooting in her chin. And lo, upon her sad desponding brow, the cruel trenches of besieging age, with seams but most unseemly gan to show her place was looking for the seventh stage. And where her raven tresses used to flow, some locks that time had left her in his rage, and some mock ringlets made her forehead shady, a compound like our psalms of Teat and Brady. Then for her shape, alas, how satin wrecks and bends and corkscrews all the frame about, doubles the hams and crooks the straightest necks, draws in the nape and pushes forth the snout, makes backs and stomachs concave or convex, witness those pensioners called in and out, who all day watching first and second rater, quaintly unbend themselves but grow no straighter. So time with fair Bianca dealt, and made her shape a bow that once was like an arrow. His iron hand upon her spine he lay, and twisted all awry her winsome marrow. In truth it was a change, she had obeyed the holy Pope before her chest grew narrow, but spectacles and palsy seemed to make her something between a glassite and a Quaker. Her grief and gall meanwhile were quite extreme, and she had ample reason for her trouble. For what sad maiden can endure to seem set in singleness, though growing double? The fancy maddened her, but now the dream, grown thin by getting bigger like a bubble, burst, but still left some fragments of its size, that, like the soap suds, smarted in her eyes. And here, just here, she began to heed the real world. Her clock chimed out its score. A clock it was of the Venetian breed, that cried the hour from 1 to 24. The works, moreover, standing in some need of workmanship, it struck some dozens more. A warning voice that clenched Bianca's fears, such strokes referring doubtless to her years. At 15 chimes she was but half a nun. By 20 she had quite renounced the veil. She thought of Julio just at 21, and 30 made her very sad and pale, to paint that ruin where her charms would run. At 40 all the maid began to fail, and thought no higher, as the late dream crossed her, of single blessedness than single Gloster. And so Bianca changed. The next sweet even, with Julio in a black Venetian bark, rode slowly and stealthily the hour 11, just sounding from the tower of old St. Mark. She sat with eyes turned quietly to heaven, perchance rejoicing in the grateful dark that veiled her blushing cheek, for Julio brought her, of course, to break the ice upon the water. But what a puzzle is one's serious mind to open. Oysters, when the ice is thick, are not so difficult and disinclined, and Julio felt the declaration stick about his throat in a most awful kind. However, he contrived by bits to pick his trouble forth, much like a rotten cork, groped from a long-necked bottle with a fork. But love is still the quickest of all readers, and Julio spent besides those signs profuse that English telegraphs and foreign pleaders in help of language are so apt to use. Arms, shoulders, fingers, all were interceders, nods, shrugs, and bends. Bianca could not choose but soften to his suit with more facility. He told his story with so much agility. Be thou my park, and I will be thy deer. So he began at last to speak or quote. Be thou my bark, and I thy gondolier, for passion takes this figurative note. Be thou my light, and I thy chandelier. Be thou my dove, and I will be thy coat. My lily be, and I will be thy river. Be thou my life, and I will be thy liver. This, with more tender logic of the kind, he poured into her small and shell-like ear. The timidity against his lips inclined. Meanwhile her eyes glanced on the silver sphere that even now began to steal behind a dewy vapour which was lingering near, wherein the dull moon crept all dim and pale, just like a virgin putting on the veil. Bidding adieu to all her sparks, the stars that erst had wooed and worshipped in her train, Saturn and Hesperus and gallant Mars, never to flirt with heavenly eyes again. Meanwhile, remindful of the convent bars, Bianca did not watch these signs in vain, but turned to Julio at the dark eclipse with words like verbal kisses on her lips. He took the hint full speedily, and, backed by love and night and the occasion's meetness, bestowed a something on her cheek that smacked, though quite in silence, of ambrosial sweetness. That made her think all other kisses lacked till then, but she knew not of completeness, being used but sisterly salutes to feel insipid things like sandwiches of veal. He took her hand, and soon she felt him wring the pretty fingers all instead of one. Anon his stealthy arm began to cling about her waist that had been clasped by none. Their dear confessions I forbear to sing, since cold description would but be outrun, for bliss and Irish watches have the power in 20 minutes to lose half an hour.